Hey everybody, what's going on? This is Sam from Historic Travels and welcome to another video. And as always, before we get started today, I'd just like to take a quick moment to welcome all my new subscribers and to thank everybody who's been leaving me comments and messages down below. Thank you guys so much, I really appreciate it. And if you would like to take a couple extra steps to help support the channel a little bit more, there's a merch store and a Patreon for this channel in the links below. Thank you guys so much for all your support. Okay guys, so I do have one last thing I need to say before we get started on this video. A couple of days ago, we passed another huge milestone on this channel and hit the 50,000 subscriber mark. And guys, I don't even know what to say. I mean, that number just blows my mind. I mean, just the thought that 50,000 of you liked my content enough to hit the subscribe button and, help support the channel and help support what I do here on YouTube. I mean, honestly, it just means the world to me. And it's because of all of you that I'm able to do this as a job now. I mean, all the support you guys do, from the live streams to the comments, you guys watching my videos, the feedback I get. I mean, honestly, I could not do this without all of you. So guys, seriously, thank you very much. And hey, who knows, maybe we'll hit 100,000 subscribers in the near future. I can only hope. But anyway, guys, seriously, thank you. And hey, without any further ado, let's get into today's topic. When we last left the RMS Olympic, it was Sunday, April 14th, 1912, 11:40 p.m. The Olympic was steaming west from New York City, bound for Southampton, and up to this point during this voyage, it had been pretty uneventful. The ship was proceeding to Southampton at a good speed, the engines were operating normally, basically everything was well on board the Olympic. Although, all that can't be said for the Olympic's sister ship, the RMS Titanic. The Olympic's brand new sister ship, the RMS Titanic, which is currently sailing to New York City from Southampton, has just struck an iceberg in the North Atlantic. Now, even though the Titanic will begin to sink upon impact with the iceberg, it would still be quite some time before the Olympic knew the situation of its sister ship, the Titanic. Now, there are two reasons as to why it would still be quite some time before the Olympic became aware of the Titanic situation. Number one, even though the Titanic struck the iceberg at 11:40 p.m. on April 14, 1912, it would still be around a half hour or so before the Titanic would start broadcasting a distress call. I believe the first official distress call from the Titanic originated around 12:15 a.m. on April the 15th, 1912. Now, even though the Titanic would start broadcasting a distress call then, the Olympic wouldn't pick it up for still another half hour. I believe the first official message sent from the Olympic to the Titanic was around 12:45 a.m. But even when the Olympic did try to contact the Titanic at 12:45 a.m., it wasn't replying to the Titanic's distress call. I will talk more about that in a minute. But you see, the reason the Olympic would not pick up the Titanic's distress call right away was because of the distance that the Olympic was from the Titanic. You see, the way wireless technology worked at the time, or wireless radio technology worked at the time, was the further away a location was, the louder you had to have your radio set in order to hear the faint dots and dashes of Morse code from that area. Now, at the time the Titanic struck the iceberg, its sister ship Olympic was around 500 miles away from the Titanic. So at that distance, the dots and dashes from the Titanic, or from the Olympic to Titanic, would have been very faint, very hard to hear. So that's the main reason as to why it would still be quite some time before the Olympic would become fully aware of the Titanic situation. And it's also important to note that at 500 miles away, there is no way the Olympic would be able to help the Titanic. Even at full speed, it would take the Olympic somewhere around a day to reach the location at which the Titanic is sinking. Now, there were a good number of ships that were much closer to the Titanic than its sister ship, the Olympic, was at the time of the sinking, and these vessels would pick up the Titanic's distress call much more quickly and much more easily than the Olympic would. One of these vessels is known as the Carpathia, and at the time of the sinking, it was around 58 miles away from the Titanic, and it would be this ship that would end up coming to the Titanic's aid and rescue the Titanic survivors. Although, as the sinking of the Titanic continued to play out, and the ship continued to broadcast its distress signal, more and more ships were beginning to clue into the dire situation that the Titanic was facing, and one of these ships would be the Olympic. Although the Olympic didn't clue in to the Titanic's disaster or current situation in the way that you would expect. Now, at roughly 12:45 a.m., the Olympic did try to contact the Titanic, although it wasn't a response to the Titanic's distress call. You see, at 12:45 a.m., the Olympic, still unaware as to what's going on with the Titanic, tried to send a basic service message from this ship to the Titanic. It was just a routine message that ships send to each other. Although the Olympic didn't receive a response from the Titanic. But as the wireless radio operator on the Olympic was listening to all the other wireless messages that were going through the ocean that night, it seems like they were starting to clue into the situation the Titanic was in, but they didn't understand what was going on in full. And I'll talk more about that in a minute. Anyway, after the Olympic sent the service call message and the Titanic didn't respond, the Carpathia did in fact pick up the Olympic service call message and then asked the Titanic, "Don't you hear the Olympic calling you?" And then Jack Phillips, the wireless operator on the Titanic, replied to the Carpathia, "No, I cannot read him for rush of air and noise of steam." What Jack Phillips was referring to when he said he could not hear the Olympic because of the rush of air and noise of steam was all the steam on the Titanic being ejected through the ship's massive funnels. You see, at the time of the iceberg impact, the Titanic was operating under a full load of steam, and when the ship stopped, they had to get all that steam off of the ship, because if they didn't eject the steam and the steam pressure continued to build up, the boilers and the steam pressure could potentially cause the ship to explode. So for the next hour and a half or so after the ship hit the iceberg, steam was venting out of the Titanic's massive funnels, making communication on the ship extremely difficult. And this is why Jack Phillips was having trouble hearing the Olympic and other vessels that were very far away, because he was listening for the faint dots and dashes of Morse code from these ships, all the while listening to the massive roar of steam being ejected from the Titanic's massive funnels. Now, even though the Olympic had yet to hear from the Titanic, even from its service call message that the ship had sent a little bit before, it was starting to clue in that something may be wrong with its sister ship due to other wireless radio transmissions that other ships were transmitting throughout the evening. So the Olympic then did try to contact the Titanic again, and this time Jack Phillips was ready, and he picked up the faint dots and dashes of the Olympic's wireless transmissions. So during this transmission, the Olympic asked the Titanic who had struck an iceberg. And Jack Phillips on the Titanic responded, "We have struck an iceberg and need assistance." So the Olympic then said okay and began making preparations to head towards the Titanic's location. However, right around the same time that the Titanic and the Olympic were beginning to communicate with each other, there was another growing problem with this whole situation. You see, while the Olympic was trying to get more details into what was happening with the Titanic, several of the other ships that were close to the Titanic were all beginning to transmit messages over the wireless at once. Now, what you have to remember is, back then, there were no different radio frequencies or anything. Whenever ships start to communicate with each other over wireless, any other ship or transmitter in the area can pick up those transmissions. So, because all of these ships were trying to communicate with Titanic at the exact same time, the Olympic was having increasing difficulty trying to communicate with Titanic. It actually got so bad that the Olympic could not talk to the Titanic at all. So the wireless operator on the Olympic sent a message to all ships telling them to stop transmitting and to stop talking so it could talk to the Titanic. There's a really good video on YouTube called Titanic in Her Own Words that takes the dots and dashes of Morse code that were being transmitted that night and puts English text or English voices on them so you can understand what is being said. I will play a short audio clip from that video just so you get a taste as to what the Olympic and the Titanic were dealing with when they were trying to communicate with each other that night.
This is Olympic. This is Titanic. This is Virginian. SOS calling Titanic. CQD. This is Virginian. CQD calling Titanic. This is Titanic. Cape Race to Virginia. SOS. Report to your captain. SOS. The Titanic has struck iceberg and requires immediate assistance. Received. Olympic to Titanic. CQD. SOS. Olympic to Titanic. This is Titanic. Carpathia to Titanic. We have struck an iceberg and are sinking. We are coming your way. SOS. Coming at full speed. CQD. Doing 15 knots. Received. Olympic to all stations. Virginian calling Cape Race. Olympic to all stations. This is Baltic. Stop talking. This is Baltic. Stop talking. Stop transmitting. Jamming. All stations stop talking.
Now, once the Olympic's wireless radio operator had finished sending that message to all those other ships did respond and stop transmitting, allowing much easier communication between the Olympic and the Titanic. Now, once this happened, Jack Phillips on the Titanic and the Olympic's wireless radio operator, they were doing a pretty good job at communicating with each other. So Jack Phillips took it upon himself to make sure that the Olympic was completely aware of everything that was going on with the Titanic, and he wanted to be sure that the Olympic was coming to their aid and completely knew the situation. And it did seem like Jack Phillips was succeeding, until the Olympic sent the following message. The Olympic asked the Titanic, and remember, it's like 1:30 in the morning at this point. The Titanic is rapidly sinking. But the Olympic asked the Titanic, "Are you steaming southerly to meet us?" And Jack Phillips on the Titanic just stopped transmitting. He literally just froze over the Morse key. And he was like, wait, what? Did the Olympic just ask us if we were steaming southerly to meet them? So then, after pausing for a moment, Jack Phillips on the Titanic sent a very angry message to the wireless operator on the Olympic, because he was like, how on earth are they not getting this? And he said to them, we are putting passengers off in the boats. We are putting women off in the boats. Sinking. Just to try to make the wireless operator on the Olympic understand. I mean, just the whole idea of a sinking ship steaming southerly to meet the Olympic. I mean, Jack Phillips just could not comprehend that. And then it seems like after this, finally, the Olympic understood what was going on and began to make all haste to the location at which the Titanic was sinking. Now, as the sinking of the Titanic continued to progress, all the ships, including the Olympic, that were in communication with the Titanic noticed something odd. You see, as more and more time went by, all these ships were having an increasingly hard time talking to the Titanic. Now, what was going on was, as the ship was continuing to sink, the power on board the Titanic was getting weaker and weaker. And the way wireless radio systems at the time worked was the more power you could feed into them, the farther they could broadcast a signal. And as the Titanic was continuing to sink, the ship's power was getting weaker and weaker, and it was getting more and more difficult for ships to hear the Titanic, until eventually the signal from Titanic died out entirely. And all that was left now were all the ships on the Atlantic wondering what had just happened to the Titanic. Now, at around 2:20 a.m., the Olympic then tried to reach the Titanic again, but received no response. So the Olympic then tried to contact other ships to see if any of them had heard from Titanic, and all the other ships told the Olympic that they hadn't. And as all of you know, 2:20 a.m. is the exact time that the RMS Titanic broke in half and slipped beneath the surface. So now all the people on the Titanic that weren't lucky enough to get a lifeboat are now beginning to freeze to death in the freezing cold waters of the North Atlantic. Now, the Carpathia officially reached the site the Titanic went down at roughly 3:30 a.m., and upon arrival, it immediately began work in picking up all the survivors of the Titanic disaster that were in some of the Titanic's lifeboats. Now, while the recovery effort was going on, all the other ships that were in communication with the Titanic were now talking to the Carpathia, and they were asking the Carpathia if they needed any assistance in recovering the Titanic survivors. And after a little bit of time, it quickly became apparent that the Carpathia was more than capable of rescuing everybody who had survived the sinking of the Titanic. So the Carpathia told all those other ships that assistance wasn't needed and for them to resume their course. Now, even after all of this, the Olympic still continued to steam towards the site of the Carpathia and the site at which the Titanic went down. And then when the Olympic got within 100 miles of where the Carpathia was, the Olympic then messaged the Carpathia and asked them if they would like them to take the Titanic survivors off of the Carpathia and transfer them over to the Olympic. Now, the crew on the Carpathia ran this by J. Bruce Ismay, who was on board the Titanic when she went down and is the head of the White Star Line. And he decided against it. He thought that if all the survivors of the Titanic disaster saw the nearly identical sister ship to the Titanic steaming up to them, he thought it would cause a lot of psychological distress in the Titanic survivors. So he decided against it. He told the Olympic to continue its course and that they would proceed to New York City on board the Carpathia. Upon receiving this message, the Olympic then resumed its course for Southampton. Now, as a token of respect to everybody who had just died on board the Titanic, for the rest of the voyage, the captain of the Olympic decided to not have the ship's band play any more concerts on board the Olympic for the rest of the voyage. In his mind, this was not a time to be celebrating or having fun or laughing and drinking champagne or whatever. You know, in his mind, a great tragedy had just occurred, and they need to take this time for the rest of the voyage to remember all of those and pay respect to everyone who had just died on board the RMS Titanic. All right, everybody. Well, hey, I think I'm going to wrap up the video here. This seems like a good spot to pause the Olympic timeline series for now. So make sure you tune in next time as we continue the story of the Titanic sister ship, the Olympic, and we talk about everything that happened to this vessel during the immediate fallout of the Titanic disaster. And boy, let me tell you, a lot of stuff really did happen to the Olympic right after the Titanic went down. So tune in next time for that. All right, guys. Well, hey, one last time, I just want to give you guys a big thank you for helping us reach 50,000 subscribers on this channel. I never dreamed that we would hit this incredible milestone on this channel, and I really couldn't do it without all your guys' support. So once again, guys, thank you all very much. I would not be here without you guys. All right, everybody. Well, hey, thank you all so much for watching. Be sure you leave a like. If you're new here, subscribe. And all right, everybody. Well, hey, thank you all so much for being here, and I'll see you in the next one. Have a good night, everybody. I'll see you next time. Special thanks to Patreon Captain level supporter Callum Whaley. Thank you so much for all the support, man.